Hello, BookTube. Comic book fans out there who watch this channel will have noticed that I did not make a comic book video on Wednesday. Wednesday is new comic book day here in America, and once again, I didn't go to my local comic shop because once again, I checked the lists ahead of time and there was nothing to bring me to the local comic shop. No ongoing issue, no special issues, no reprints of any kind. There was nothing on the list that would draw me out of my way, even the small distance out of my way that my comic shop is. So I didn't go. And I know it's a little bit cranky, but I ascribe some of that fault to the comic companies. Marvel and DC, the two big superhero comic book companies. DC is the home of Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman. Marvel is the home of Spider-Man and the X-Men and the Hulk. For the longest time, I did go to comic shops and bought issues. Now, part of the reason why I don't do that anymore with the same kind of clockwork regularity is that Marvel and DC now regularly reprint a lot of their older comics, and they don't do it every week. So there's less emphasis for me on regular weekly comics. But another part of the reason is that there's not a lot there to draw me to the comic shop. And for that, I do blame the comic book companies. I think that they've become balkanized. They've become less creative, less audacious. The good writers and good artists don't tend to stay with titles for very long. And both Marvel and DC are all enamored of special, big, isolated miniseries storylines, big event comics that don't do anything for me usually. DC Comics, for instance, my own preference of the two, has at least two big events that are ongoing right now that are neither one have any interest for me at all. One is called Deceased, in which the core roster of superheroes are besieged on all sides by the whole world that suddenly transforms into kinds of, mindless zombies. And the other is Heroes in Crisis, a miniseries called Heroes in Crisis, which has absolutely gorgeous artwork. But it's a ridiculous storyline about how all the heroes and villains in the DC universe need psychotherapy. And there's a place out in the middle of nowhere where they can go and get psychotherapy. A totally ridiculous idea that is a poor graft of the Marvel sensibility of superheroes onto the DC world. The standard phrase has always been that Marvel superheroes are ordinary people trying to be gods, and that DC superheroes are gods trying to be ordinary people. And although there are gray areas that blur that distinction in both companies, for instance, one of Marvel's signature characters is in fact a god, that tends to be the case, where Marvel superheroes are recognizable by their neuroses, by their feet of clay. And DC superheroes are more like, they're more iconic. They're more superpowered servants of the peace, with a few exceptions, especially that have been exaggerated in recent years. Like, for instance, keep in mind that for 70 years, Batman was exactly what I'm describing, a perfectly rock-solid, ordinary keeper of the peace, a superpowered policeman, basically. It was at his very beginning, and it's only now that he is this icon of mental dysfunction who is a driven, haunted vigilante. I think that works better for the character, but that hasn't always been the case. And as usual, when there's a week where nothing drew me into the comic shop, I automatically start thinking about what would draw me into the comic shop, and that makes me think of the past. For forever and ever, I went to comic shops every week, or to the drugstore before there were comic shops. I am, in a way, a very good example of the market that DC and Marvel should be shooting for. I'm a lifelong fan of comic books who's been reading them for a very long time, and I'm willing to do so now, and I have the disposable income to do so now. You'd think that it would be a perfect time, but no, no. Instead, on weeks where there are no comics for me, I think about what would draw me into comic shops. And one of the things I had in mind this week, I thought I owed you a comic book video, so I thought I'd talk a little about one comic that would definitely bring me into the comic shops, and that's Superboy. And those of you who are familiar with 2019 DC Comics would say, well, aren't you embarrassed for choices when it comes to Superboy? It's not like you don't have any. You have two. You have a Superboy who's a part of the Teen Titans, and you have a Superboy who teams up with Damian Wayne, the son of Bruce Wayne, in the Adventures of the Super Sons. But neither one of those is the Superboy I'm talking about. The Superboy in the Teen Titans is named Kon-El, and he is a clone who was made from material from Superman and Lex Luthor. He does not have Kryptonian superpowers. He has a set of superpowers on his own, and a whole bunch of personality problems on his own, a whole bunch of bitternesses and neuroses, and a whole long character history on his own that doesn't have anything to do with being rocketed to Earth from the doomed planet Krypton. And the Superboy in the Adventures of the Super Sons is the son of Superman and Lois Lane, the in-continuity son of Clark Kent and Lois Lane. And that's a whole different story in its own right. The Superboy I'm talking about existed for a very, very long time. He's a much older character than either one of those. And that is Kal-El of Krypton, Superman. Superboy being the original muscular teenager, Superboy being the adventures of Superman when he was a boy. The character was created by Jerry Siegel, who's one of the two men who created Superman. And Jerry Siegel created Superboy in the 1930s. And once again, in this as in so many other ways, he was ahead of his time. And big companies didn't think there was any market for hero characters who were children, and just routinely turned it down until 1945, when Superboy made his original appearance in More Fun Comics, and took off. Almost immediately, letters started coming in saying, we like this character, we want more. And DC provided more. Superboy had adventures in More Fun Comics, and then soon he moved over to Adventure Comics. And had even more adventures there, and eventually, I mean, not very long after that, in the 1950s, I think, got his own comic book, got his own #1 issue, Superboy #1, at a time when superhero comics were experiencing their post-World War II slump of a very severe nature, and almost nobody got their own comic book. I mean, a compilation adventure stories like Adventure Comics, sure, but their own comic book? I'd be willing to bet that Superboy was in the first 5, certainly the first 10 comic book characters to get their own comic book, because he was that much of a success. And in the 1950s, that already successful formula got a shot in the arm like no other. They got a shot in the arm like no other in the form of a man named Mort Weisinger, who took over the editorial duties on, among other things, Adventure Comics, where Superboy was starring. Mort Weisinger was a wonderful, genial, funny man, and an unbelievably strong, die-hard fan of science fiction. Believed in its concepts, believed in its writers, believed in all of its magazines. There was a booming time for science fiction short stories on your newsstand. He was a science fiction geek of the first order. And when he got his hands on Superboy in Adventure Comics, he started importing a lot of that sensibility. Suddenly, Superboy's adventures became more cosmic and started to involve things like, effectively, clones or time travel or space aliens or whatever. The underlying concept of this Superboy is radically different from the two Superboys that I mentioned. He is Clark Kent. He is Kal-El of Krypton, who was rocketed to Earth as a baby, found and adopted by the Kent family. It's only in Superboy comics that Jonathan and Martha Kent get first names. And a whole bunch of other, Mort Weisinger introduced a whole bunch of other characters, a teenage Lex Luthor, Lana Lang, Pete Ross, and also, much to my delight, Krypto, the Superdog. Turns out that Kal-El's father, Jor-El, once he realized that planet Krypton was doomed, intended to make a rocket to escape with himself and his family, but in order to test it, a la the Soviets and the dogs they sent into space, he sends the family dog into space first, and the dog's craft is struck by a meteorite and lost in space, and only crashes to Earth after Kal-El, Jor-El's baby son, has been sent to Earth. So, in a kind of twist that was very common in the 1950s, Superboy is reintroduced to his childhood pet, and Superboy puts on a costume as soon as he discovers that he has superpowers. In fact, later on, it's further elaborated that he was a super baby. That when he was a baby, he was having adventures. When he no talk good. When he was given baby patois by the writers involved. But the idea was, the underlying idea was that this is a Superboy of a more innocent time. fighting bank robbers and having all sorts of outlandish adventures in 1950s small town Midwest America. A boy and his dog, both of whom have superpowers, both of whom love their parents and live with their parents, and who have all sorts of crazy adventures that are done in 9 pages. Most issues of Adventure Comics had 3 stories. Most issues of Superboy, once that title got off and running, had 3 stories. They were all short. They usually had a very gimmicky ending. There was almost no pathos. And the series was a success. It was this series. It was Superboy. That is Super Baby. But you also have these classic Kurt Swan covers of all these gimmicky things. Flying Fist, there's Lana Lang, constantly scheming to find out whether or not Superboy is Clark Kent and vice versa. There you have, this was another regular gimmick of the Superboy comics, is that he would meet someone else who was superpowered, who would come to Smallville, and they would have superpowers just briefly, and it would be a dream or a magic serum or something like that. And it would, or another classic idea is that Superman turns into a delinquent. This was the era of juvenile delinquents, so the idea was that, or that Superboy would have some sort of cognitive break, and there'd be a big break between Superboy and Clark Kent. That happened many, many, many times. And also, in the Superboy comic, DC Comics enlisted an artist named Neil Adams, who would go on to much greater success as the artist of Green Lantern and Green Arrow, and also Batman. But they got Neil Adams to do a whole bunch of fantastic Superboy covers. Really, really evocative stuff. Look at the rain there. The rain effects. Or I just killed Lana Lang. Look at that. It's DOA in cold blood. Or wait, I've got a really good one here. Yeah, look at this. He's exiled on the moon. Just awesome. Just incredible. And that was the Superboy that brought me into the comic shops, was The Adventures of Superman when he was a boy. These are simple issues, one and done, no continuations, no nothing. They did expand to include the rest of the DC lineup. Naturally, Mort Weisinger wanted to do that, even though it played Bloody Hob with established continuity. He wanted to make sure that teenage Clark Kent met a teenage Bruce Wayne, that he met a teenage Green Arrow, that he met a teenage Aquaman, and that they had adventures that somehow or other they would not remember, or had not remembered when they were older in the Justice League. But Mort Weisinger, for a couple of different reasons, Mort Weisinger's incredible creativity and his willingness to subsidize the creativity of others, threw a monkey wrench in his plans with Adventure Comics, because he got together with another avid science fiction fan called Otto Binder, who came up with an idea, just again, a one and done, thrown off idea, like the type that fills these issues. I mean, look at this, the day that it's, what do we have here, where it's raining Superboys. One of those ideas that Otto Binder came up with was the Legion of Superheroes, a trio of superpowered teenagers from 1,000 years in the future. In other words, 1,000 years in the future, when the legend of Superman had spread all across the galaxy. And they have a club for superpowered teenagers 1,000 years in the future, and they think, wouldn't it be fun to invite Superboy to join us? So they take a time machine, they have a time machine, and they go back and induct Superboy into the Legion of Superheroes. And it was a fun adventure. They have a fake initiation routine where it looks like he's not going to be good enough for the Legion, and that all turns out to be a joke. And that was it. And Otto Binder did that, and he had a bunch of other ideas, and so did Mort Weisinger, and they moved on. But letters started coming in. Oh my, did they ever? Of people saying, well, yeah, Superboy's great, Crypto is great, oh my, won't Lana Lang ever let up, but we want more of the Legion. Could you bring back the Legion? Please bring back the Legion. So they did. Of course, they did. And eventually, the Legion became, in fact, in short order, the Legion became so popular that they started sharing billing with Superboy. And that went on for a long time, even in his own comic book. So you have Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes. And in both cases, in Adventure Comics and then in Superboy itself, in both cases, eventually the Legion just took over. So there were periods where if you were a Superboy fan and you wanted Superboy adventures without the Legion, there were periods scattered throughout the 60s and 70s where you would have had a hard time finding that on newsstands because it was all the Legion. And that sort of was the pattern for a while. Superboy got a comic book of his own relaunched at the same time that the Legion got a comic without Superboy. So that there were sort of parallel issues. But something about those issues never really... I'm a huge fan, but something about those issues, those relaunched issues, never really did much for me. They seemed a little bit bloodless, especially compared to the great storytelling that was going on over in the Legion of Superheroes. And then the character of Superboy became a TV show, a live-action TV show, first starring John Hames Newton until he had one too many DUIs and was booted from the role, in which case fans had originally said, well, isn't John Hames Newton just a little bit old to play Superboy? He's well into his 20s. Shouldn't you have a teenager play Superboy? And when he got the boot, the Paramount recast The Adventures of Superboy with an actor who was even older, Jerry Christopher, who went on to star in the rest of the show. And the show did well. It transplanted Superboy to Florida and to college, but it was a success. And once it was retooled with the addition of Jerry Christopher, with the addition of new writers, with the addition of Sherman Howard as Lex Luthor, who had some fantastic episodes and some fantastic lines, it started to attract good writing. And a couple of great cameos, including Ron Ely, who was Tarzan in the 1960s, and who plays a gray, spit-curled, older version of Superman in one great two-part episode. Once that show became a success, then DC Comics capitalized on it by making a comic book of Superboy all over again. So those of us who had been watching this, who had been loving the Superboy comics for decades, suddenly had Superboy in comic stores again. It was Superboy the comic book. There's Bizarro Superboy, but Emmett Art. A little bit of a joke there. But these were just tepid adventures along the lines of the TV show, trying not to outstrip the TV show, which had, a very limited special effects budget, and of course not doing anything that would ruin the TV show. It was kind of a companion comic book, but it was fun while it lasted. But it didn't last forever. It had a very discreet terminus, because shortly after this series, DC did a company-wide reboot in which they decided to junk their continuity, to get rid of tradition, and allow the fan favorite writer and artist John Byrne to remake the character along sort of vaguely corporately dictated guidelines. And one of those guidelines was that Clark Kent, Kal-El of Krypton, did not put on a Superman costume and start fighting crime until he was an adult. I remember when I read that wrinkle. I first read about it, then I saw it in a comic book, and then I saw it sort of codified in an official history of DC Comics that was done in 2 issues. And suddenly realized, if Superboy was the inspiration for the Legion of Superheroes and was their first major new addition to the team, so if there's no more Superboy, then A, what do you do with the Legion of Superheroes? And B, well then what about those hundreds and hundreds of Superboy adventures that I've read my whole life? What happens to them? You're saying that character doesn't exist anymore. Needless to say, as you can tell from my tone of voice, I did not agree with this decision on DC's part at all, and I haven't agreed with any company-wide reboots ever since. A long and complicated backstory, a long and complicated back-issue tradition is only a hindrance to writers who don't know how to do it. And that ought to be the thing that separates the good writers from the bad ones. But simplifying continuity never did anything but cheese off the long-term fans. And that's not a good idea. They are your base. So that's not a good idea. But anyway, that company-wide reboot was followed by the death of Superman, an event in comic books that made the national news. Dan Rather talked about it, where they decided to kill off Superman. It obviously wasn't going to be permanent. He is the biggest licensed company in the world. But nevertheless, for a while there was no Superman, and 4 Superman-esque characters stepped into the void to take his place. And one of them was a boy who wanted to be called Superman, but everybody calls him Superboy. And it turns out in the length of time that he is this clone character that I talked about. He is a clone creation, doesn't have Kryptonian superpowers, and that Superboy had a run of his own, a comic book run of his own, with art by Tom Grummett, and it was very enjoyable. It wasn't my Superboy, but it was very enjoyable. It had a clever kind of meta twist, and at one point during another gigantic crossover event called 0 Hour, this clone Superboy actually briefly faces off against my Superboy, the real Superboy. It's a continuity bending type thing, and I was very pleased to see. DC usually doesn't do this sort of thing, but when it comes to the big S, they do. I was very pleased to see my Superboy, who is effectively infinitely powerful, mop the floor with a clone who has telekinesis. That was pleasing to see, and the storyline goes on from there. But that was as close as we got. That was as close as fans got, was that one time, until there was a run of Adventure Comics was relaunched, and there was also the Legion of Superheroes, and for a brief time, the writers of those issues decided to try to retroactively honor all of those great Superboy and Legion issues that I had thought were cut adrift in continuity by having the clone Superboy, Con-El, be accidentally transported to the future, to 1,000 years in the future, and he puts on the Superboy costume. Only then. He doesn't wear it back in his own time frame, in his own time period, but he did in those issues, so that in comparatively recent times we got covers like this. The Legion, the classic Legion, and Superboy. Something that longtime fans had gone without for decades and thought we would never see again. There it is. I don't know what that is. Maybe Kryptonians have more abs than a normal person, but one way or another, the Superboy of these issues certainly did not look like that. But that was fun. That was a fun interval. It didn't last very long, but it was fun to have Superboy with the Legion of Superheroes, even though it wasn't, the right Superboy still. And then there was another cartoon. Young Justice became a cartoon, and that revived the clone Superboy. It gave him a black T-shirt and jeans, no real superpower, no real super costume, and a bunch of other teen characters, sort of an update of the Teen Titans. And that brings us to the present day. That is the Superboy who exists in DC continuity now. And I wish that weren't the case. I know that puts me in the drastic minority, but I wish that weren't the case. Superboy, the Jerry Siegel created character who is the adventures of Superman when he was a boy, is currently the object of a protracted and incredibly acrimonious lawsuit between DC Comics and the Siegel and Schuster estates. It's been settled and resettled. It's still a nightmare, and I think that is why, one of the reasons anyway, but I bet it would be the big reason why there is no Superboy comic of Superboy in the past. And I wish there were. I know this will never happen, but I wish. I mean, DC obviously will win that lawsuit. They should win it by doing the right thing by the creators. I don't think that would be hard to do. Cut them a stipend and give them a credit, and then you've got Superboy. And what I wish would happen is that those things would take place simply outside of continuity, that they would take place in the 1950s, even though in current DC continuity, Superman is always about 30 years behind the present day, so he would have come to Earth in the 90s. Even so, I wish that they would do that. The romance, the sheer simplicity, the sweetness of a monthly comic book starring a teenage Superboy with his super dog, fighting crime and having problems. As a teenager in small-town Midwestern America, I would go to the comic shop and buy that. That doesn't exist, and I don't think it's ever going to exist, but I just thought I'd wool gather about it just for a bit. So that's your comic book flashback issue thing here to this week. No new issues to talk about, just very old issues. Superboy. The Superboy that I miss. A teenage Kal-El learning how to be human, learning about his powers, and with the company of his dog. And in these old comic books, everything was always hunky dory with Ma and Pa Kent. But maybe that wouldn't be true. I wouldn't want dysfunction. I wouldn't want, any of the bitterness that's crept into comic books everywhere else. I wouldn't want any of that, but it could be that they disagree. And I think you get the right writer and the right artist, that would be wonderful. I would buy that, but that's not going to happen. So let's hope for better comic book stuff next week. So I'll let you know on Wednesday. Thank you, BookTube.